I never expected my accounting degree to be the thing that saved my grandmother's house. But the moment my uncle dropped that manila folder on her kitchen table, that Tuesday morning, looking so certain of himself, I felt the same cold click in my chest I feel when I open a set of financial statements and something doesn't line up. "Sit down, Abby," he said, using the exact tone he'd used when I was 9, and had tracked mud across Grandma Bet's carpet, like I was the one about to be corrected. His wife Rhonda stood near the doorway with her arms folded, her eyes already moving around the kitchen like she was taking inventory. The copper pots above the stove, the depression glass arranged on the open shelves, the hand-painted tiles around the backsplash that Grandma had commissioned from a local artist back in 1987. Rhonda's gaze had a specific quality I recognized from estate liquidation sales: calculating. The look of someone mentally sorting everything in sight into 3 piles: keep, sell, toss. I had been living in this house for 2 years, since the morning after my grandmother's memorial service, when I'd come back to pack a few things and found myself unable to leave. I'd stood in the kitchen, her apron still on the hook by the back door, and understood without quite meaning to that the house still needed someone in it. Someone who knew that the 3rd stair creaked, that the back bedroom window had to be propped open with a piece of dowel in summer, that the fig tree in the side yard needed to be covered before the first hard frost. So I stayed. I set up my work laptop in the sunroom where the light was good and telecommuted 3 days a week. I tended her vegetable garden. I learned her apple butter recipe from the card in her handwriting that I found tucked inside a Betty Crocker cookbook from 1962. The house on Sycamore Lane was a craftsman bungalow built in 1923. Its wide front porch and original woodwork, a quiet landmark in our part of Virginia. People photographed it in fall when the big oak out front turned. Grandma Bet had owned it outright since 1978. Bought it herself after my grandfather passed, raised my mother and my Uncle Morris in it, and watched grandchildren fill its rooms every summer. She had left it to me in a will signed in the presence of her attorney and her doctor 2 years before she passed. Which is why the folder my uncle pushed across the table made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Found this going through some of her things," he said, settling into her chair at the table, like he'd been sitting there his whole life. He hadn't asked, he just sat down. There was a safety deposit box over at Piedmont Federal I didn't know about. Took me some time to track it down. Turns out Mama had a second will. The papers inside looked professional. Official letterhead, notary seal, the right formatting. According to the document, my grandmother had decided, at some point 18 months before her death, that the house should pass to her only son as her surviving child. Rhonda had drifted into the living room while my uncle explained. I heard her heels on the original heart pine floors, her voice carrying back to us while she talked on her phone. "Yeah, it's got good bones, ceilings are high. The kitchen's a disaster, but the square footage is there." A pause. I'm thinking open concept. Take out the wall between the dining room and the living room. That wall had my great-grandfather's initials carved into the baseboard. He'd done it as a boy, pressed into the wood with a penknife, and Grandma had never sanded it away. "You'll want to start making arrangements," my uncle continued, his voice practiced and reasonable. "I know this is difficult, but the law is the law. This was her final wish, her real wish. We're prepared to give you through the end of next month. That's more than fair." I picked up the will and read it carefully, not as a granddaughter, as a professional. I'm a forensic accountant. My job is to find the things people try to hide. The numbers that don't add up, the signatures that belong to people who were supposedly in another state when they signed, the documents that look right until you know what to look for. I've testified in 3 federal fraud cases and once in a congressional hearing. I know what real documents look like, and I know what effort goes into faking them. The paper was the first tell, too bright and uniform. The kind of stock that comes out of a modern laser printer, not the slightly cream-aged paper that attorneys used 15 years ago when this document was supposedly drafted. The second tell was the signature. My grandmother had developed a tremor in her right hand in her final years, a slight drag on the tail of the capital B in Bet. This signature was smooth, steady, like someone had practiced on older samples and gotten the shape right but not the texture. The notary seal was the third thing. I tilted the page toward the window light and saw that the embossed impression was slightly off-center. The kind of minor error that happens when a seal is pressed onto a different surface and the image transfers unevenly. The name on the seal was Harold G. Fitch, Notary Public, commission expires 2024. I wrote it down while my uncle watched. "I'll need time to review this with my own attorney," I said. My voice came out level. I'd learned that in depositions, keep your voice steady when your hands want to shake. My uncle nodded, like that was exactly the answer he'd expected from someone who didn't understand she'd already lost. "Of course. But don't drag this out, Abby. My attorney says everything is in order." He gathered his copies back into the folder. "Rhonda's already been in touch with a contractor. We'd like to get started before winter." After they left, I went to work. I opened the Virginia Notary Public Commission database and searched for Harold G. Fitch. His commission had lapsed 8 months before the date on the document. A notarization from an expired commission is legally void under Virginia Code. That was my first crack. I photographed every page of the documents and sent copies to Mr. Harwood, the estate attorney who had overseen the original will. His paralegal called me back within 2 hours. The firm listed on the will's header had merged with another practice in 2019 and no longer operated under that name. Whoever had made this document hadn't checked whether the law firm still existed. The doorbell rang before I'd finished my notes. Mrs. Kowalski from next door stood on the porch with a container of her stuffed cabbage rolls, which she brought whenever something was wrong. The same as she'd brought them when Grandma was sick, the same as she'd brought them the week of the funeral. "I saw their car," she said, nodding toward the street. "That man and his wife." Mrs. Kowalski had been a high school civics teacher for 31 years. She didn't miss things. She told me that Rhonda had been to the property twice in the past 3 weeks while I was at my office. Once with a tape measure and a man who took notes, once alone, walking the fence line of the backyard, photographing the detached garage. "I took pictures both times," she said. "Seemed strange, a person measuring someone else's yard." She showed me her phone. There was Rhonda in workout clothes, pacing off the side yard, on a call the whole time, times stamped, clear enough to make out her face. Mrs. Kowalski had also kept a written log, a folded sheet she produced from her coat pocket. Dates, times, the license plate number of the vehicle Rhonda had arrived in. "Your grandmother told me once she thought her son would try something eventually," Mrs. Kowalski said. She said it like she'd made her peace with it. I never forgot the way she said it. I had to stop and breathe before I could answer. "Did she say anything else?" "She said you'd be able to handle it." She patted my hand. She was very specific. After she left, I went down to the basement. Grandma Bet had been a canner. Every August, the shelves filled up with tomatoes and bread and butter pickles and apple butter and green beans, labeled in her handwriting with the year, and sometimes a brief note. "Good year," sweetened it less, or gave half to Carol. I had helped her organize those shelves every fall since I was 9 years old. I knew them the way I knew the layout of my own apartment. Which is why I noticed, when I stepped down there that evening, that the third shelf from the left was 3 inches off from where it had always been. Not much, just enough. I moved her jars carefully. The ones labeled in her handwriting, the apple butter from the last summer she was well enough to make it, and found the edge of a panel behind. It was held with a small magnetic catch, the kind sold at hardware stores for cabinet doors. Behind it sat a gray fireproof document safe with a combination dial, the kind rated to survive a house fire up to 1700 degrees. Grandma had ordered one from a catalog in the late 1990s. I had never once thought about where she'd put it. The combination was her wedding anniversary. I knew it without having to try anything else. Inside were 3 things: a sealed envelope with my name on the front in her handwriting, an unmarked flash drive, and a manila folder thicker than the one my uncle had brought. The folder held bank statements going back 12 years, each with certain transactions highlighted in yellow. Withdrawals that matched no household expense I could identify. Checks made out to a company called Saddleback Holdings LLC. A printout from the Virginia Secretary of State's corporation database showed that Saddleback Holdings LLC was registered to one Cesar Kessler, my uncle's full legal name. He had been moving money out of her accounts for over a decade. I sat on the basement floor among the canning jars and opened the envelope. Abby, she'd written, in the handwriting I had known all my life. If you're reading this, Morris has finally made his move. I've been half expecting it since 2014, when I noticed the first transfer. I want you to know I handled it quietly, the way I've handled most things with him. I moved what was left into the irrevocable trust Mr. Harwood helped me set up, and I documented everything you'll need. The flash drive has video. I recorded it with Carol from quilting. You know how Carol loves her iPad, and Mr. Harwood was present, and my doctor too. I was of sound mind. They can try to say otherwise. They'll be wrong. The house is yours, sweetheart. It always was. You're the one who knows which stair creaks and why the radiator in the back bedroom needs bleeding every November, and which tomato plants want more water than the others. Those things aren't small. Those things are everything. I love you. Be brave. I plugged the flash drive into my laptop right there on the basement floor, and there she was. Grandma Bet, in the wingback chair in the sunroom, wearing the blue cardigan she always wore in cold weather. She was 82 in the recording. Her voice was clear. "This is Bet Kessler," she said, looking directly into the camera. "Today is March 3rd. I am in full possession of my faculties, as my doctor and my attorney can confirm." She held up a copy of the local newspaper, the date visible, and looked back at the lens. "I want to be very clear about a few things." She spent 40 minutes being very clear. She described the transfers to Saddleback Holdings. She described the time my uncle had brought a notary to her home and asked her to sign documents she hadn't been given time to read. She described telling him no, and the way his expression changed when she did. She described hiring a private records researcher to trace the systematic small withdrawals over 12 years. She named the total, $43,700. "I didn't go to the police," she said near the end. "I'm his mother. That's the only reason. But I want the record to exist. I want Abby to have what she needs if it comes to that." It had come to that. I called Mr. Harwood that night. He picked up on the third ring, which told me he'd been expecting my call. "Your grandmother was remarkably organized," he said. "She left me a sealed packet 3 years ago, with instructions not to open it unless you contacted me about a challenge to the will. I think it's time." The packet contained an affidavit from her physician confirming her cognitive status at the time of the video. It contained Carol's contact information and a note that Carol held her own copy of the recording. It contained a letter from a licensed private investigator documenting the Saddleback Holdings transactions in chronological order. And it contained one more thing, a notation that the original will was recorded with the county clerk's office. Not just held by Mr. Harwood's firm, but filed as a public record. Anyone challenging it would have to go through a court that already had the document in its system. My uncle had come in from the side and found a wall. I slept 4 hours. In the morning, I made coffee in her percolator and called Gia, my closest colleague at the firm and the sharpest numbers person I had ever worked with. When I explained what I was looking at, she said, without pausing, "Forward me the statements. I'll have a forensic timeline by tonight." While Gia worked, I drove to the county courthouse and pulled the records for Saddleback Holdings LLC. Beyond the incorporation documents, I found a UCC filing, a secured interest on commercial property my uncle had tried to use as loan collateral. The property had belonged to his former mother-in-law. The loan had defaulted. There was a civil judgment against him in a neighboring county from 4 years ago. He had been down this road before. My uncle called me 2 days later. His voice was warm and measured the way it always was when he wanted something. "I hope you've had time to process all this, Abby. I know it's a lot. Sharon and I." "Rhonda," I said. A pause. "What?" "Your wife's name is Rhonda." He recovered quickly. "Of course. I just hope you understand we're not trying to make this harder than it has to be. The notary on your document let his commission expire in 2021, I said. The law firm listed on the header dissolved when it merged with another practice in 2019. The signature on the will doesn't account for the tremor my grandmother developed in 2018. I have her handwriting samples going back 20 years. I'm a forensic accountant, and I've spent the past 48 hours building a case file that includes 12 years of transactions between her accounts and an LLC registered in your name. I let that sit for a second. I've also spoken with Mr. Harwood, who has video testimony from my grandmother witnessed by her physician and 2 other individuals, recorded 3 years ago specifically in anticipation of this situation. The original will is on file with the county clerk, and I've filed a fraud complaint with the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office. Silence. Abby? Don't, I said. I've sat across the table from executives who thought they were smarter than me. You're not different. Don't call this number again unless your attorney is on the line. They came to the house anyway. 3 days later, a Saturday morning. This time, my uncle had someone with him I didn't recognize. Broad-shouldered, pressed khakis, the specific kind of casual that's meant to look official. He introduced himself as a property transition consultant, which is not a real professional category, and said they were there to begin an inventory of the premises. I opened the front door and held up my firm ID. It isn't a police badge, but it has the same psychological effect when presented with sufficient confidence. I'm a licensed forensic accountant, I said, and this property is part of an active fraud investigation. Any attempt to enter or remove any item from it constitutes interference with that investigation. I have a neighbor and a home security system that have been documenting every visit to this address for the past 2 weeks. I'd recommend speaking with a real attorney before you take another step onto this porch. Behind the consultant, I saw Mrs. Kowalski on her front porch with her phone raised. The consultant got back in his own car. My uncle stood on the walkway for a long moment, running whatever calculation he was running. Rhonda stayed in the passenger seat of the rental. She didn't get out. We had legitimate papers drawn up, he said finally, his warmth gone entirely. I know, I said. By Harold Fitch, whose commission had expired. I know who drew them up and when. I know about Saddleback Holdings. I know about the judgment in Clark County, and the Commonwealth's attorney knows all of it too. I paused. The thing about forensic accountants is that we're very patient and very thorough. Your money left a clear trail. So did everything else. He left without another word. The arrest warrants were executed 6 weeks later. My uncle and the man who had forged the documents, a disbarred paralegal doing private document work under the table. The Commonwealth's attorney added elder financial exploitation to the fraud charges, which in Virginia carries mandatory restitution. The trial took place in the spring. I testified about the document analysis, the Saddleback transactions, the forensic timeline Gia had built. Rhonda cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. She had known about the forged will, but had not known about the financial abuse stretching back 12 years. Her testimony about my uncle's specific instructions, what to photograph, what to say, what to measure, was some of the most damaging evidence presented. At sentencing, the judge read portions of my grandmother's video aloud into the record. Her voice, transcribed into a courtroom document, describing exactly what her son had done over more than a decade. The judge called her testimony a model of foresight and clarity. My uncle was sentenced to 4 years and ordered to make full restitution. After it was over, Carol from the quilting group found me in the courthouse parking lot. She had her iPad in her tote bag the way she always did. You know, she made me practice recording it 3 times, Carol said. She kept saying, I need to be in the frame, Carol, and the light has to be right. She was so particular about it. I laughed until my eyes went wet. Standing in a courthouse parking lot in April, and it felt right. It felt exactly like her. I went home to Sycamore Lane. The fig tree was budding. The garden wanted turning over. The 3rd stair creaked the way it always had, and the kitchen still smelled faintly of the cinnamon candles she'd burned every winter. Late in the afternoon I found, at the back of the cabinet where she kept her baking supplies, a small envelope I hadn't noticed before. My name on it in her handwriting. Inside was a note written on an index card, short enough to read in one breath. You already knew how to fight. I just made sure you had something worth fighting for. GB. I put it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, next to the depression glass that catches the late light, and throws it across the walls in small bright pieces. The house is mine. It always was. And I have every intention of keeping every square inch of it for as long as I have breath to tend it.